Hello everyone, this is King Gratz here, and welcome back to another episode for the Swap Streak series, this time bringing in another retro trade history video on the NHL, and this time talking about arguably one of the biggest draft busts in the modern era of NHL history. And so ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Alexandre Daigle Swap Streak. So Alexandre Daigle was a former first overall pick in the NHL draft. He was drafted by the Ottawa Senators first overall in 1993. Coming out of the QMJHL from the Victoriaville Tigers, he was seen as a very prolific scorer and arguably a generational talent at the time. His time in the Q was basically filled with all kinds of success. He had back-to-back 100-point seasons just before he made it to the NHL in 1993-94, and he was seen as that really big cornerstone player for a newly minted Ottawa Senators franchise at the NHL level. Unfortunately for Daigle, he is considered to be probably the biggest draft bust in NHL history, mainly because he just never met expectations whatsoever. His career high in points was 51 with Ottawa, and he only did that twice, 1993-94 and 1996-97. What also made him a draft bust was a combination of injuries, inconsistent play, and also the fact that he probably didn't have a lot of efforts in some occasions, and his production just never really translated to the NHL level. So in the middle of the 97-98 season, the Ottawa Senators decided to cut their losses with the former first overall pick and traded Alexandre Daigle to the Philadelphia Flyers for Pat Falloon, Vaclav Prospal, and a second-round pick in 1998. Pat Falloon never got traded from Ottawa after this. Vaclav Prospal is a notable player, and I have talked about him in one of my previous videos on one of the most traded players in NHL history, and technically this begins Prospal's trade history right here and now, but I will come back to him later. The second round pick in 98 was used by Ottawa to draft Chris Balla. Was drafted basically late in the second round, but he's probably considered a draft bust because he basically amounted to mostly a minor league player. However, he does have his own trade history. He was traded for the first time to the Nashville Predators for Peter Smarek. Smarek never got traded from Ottawa after this, while Chris Balla on the same day was then dealt from Nashville to Minnesota for Curtis Murphy. Murphy never got traded from Nashville after this, and for Chris Balla, his trade history ends once we got another trade where he was sent in 2004 to the Colorado Avalanche for Jordan Krestanovich. Krestanovich himself never being traded again after this. For Alexandre Daigle, his time in Philly also did not last very long. He was playing for a good chunk of the 97-98 season with the Flyers, but also didn't really meet expectations. And as a result, he was traded not too long after getting to Philadelphia, in which he was sent in 1999 to the Edmonton Oilers for Andrei Kovalenko. Kovalenko, if you're old enough to remember, he was actually one of the pieces that went to the Montreal Canadiens as part of the Patrick Waugh trade, but he was traded one more time from Philadelphia, having gone to the Carolina Hurricanes for Adam Burt. For Adam Burt, he never got traded from Philly after this, and for Kovalenko, this ended his trade history as well. For Daigle, he actually didn't last long in Edmonton either, as on the same day, the Oilers decided to trade him to the Tampa Bay Lightning for Alex Selivanov. Selivanov himself doesn't have much of a trade history. It basically ends right here. And for Daigle, he also didn't spend much time in Tampa, and he was traded one more time, this time going to the New York Rangers for future considerations. Future considerations didn't amount to much here for Tampa, if anything at all, and for Daigle, his time in New York was also fairly short-lived, and I will come back to him. But let's get back to Vaclav Prospal, because I mentioned in a previous video of mine that he is one of the most traded players in NHL history, and the original trade of Alexandre Daigle to Philadelphia commences Prospal's trade history. So Prospal was traded again, this time going to the Florida Panthers for either a third-round pick in 2002 or a fourth-round pick in 2001. This draft pick actually was rerouted back to the Panthers in a subsequent trade, and this trade essentially saw the Senators pick up Mike Sillinger. His time in Ottawa was very short-lived. As you recall from my previous video as well, Sillinger is the most traded player in NHL history, but he was never traded by the Senators as he actually left as a free agent at the end of the 2001 season. For the Panthers, I couldn't figure out what they got with this draft pick. I couldn't figure out if it was 2001 or 2002. For some reason, the data doesn't really exist. I checked the many sources, but it's just not there. For Prospal, his time in Florida was also short-lived. After some time, he was then dealt to the Tampa Bay Lightning for Ryan Johnson and a sixth-round pick in 2003, which turned into Doug O'Brien. Ryan Johnson himself didn't really amount to much as an NHL player, and he never got traded again after this. And O'Brien was a reasonably solid NHL player, and he did get traded as a player going to the Anaheim Ducks for Joe Roulier. The story is that this pick basically got traded back to Tampa. I couldn't figure out how it got traded back to Tampa, but somehow it did, and the Lightning would later trade O'Brien a few years later for Joe Roulier. Roulier himself never being traded again, and for O'Brien never getting traded by the Ducks. For Vaclav Prospal, he does get traded a few more times after this initial trade from Florida to Tampa, but technically it's disjointed. So his next trade technically involves him going from Anaheim to Tampa Bay. And obviously there's a disconnect right there, and that was at least a few years down the road. So as a result, we basically ended right then and there. This is pretty much the end of the story when it comes to the trade history and how Alexandre Daigle impacted the NHL at that level. To summarize his career after Ottawa, Daigle didn't have much success, if any at all. After going to the Rangers for future considerations, he basically was playing sort of a more depth role and actually spent some time in the AHL that year. He then decided to sit out 2 full seasons of play and would not play in the NHL again until 2002-2003, when the Pittsburgh Penguins brought him back on a minor league deal. He played very well in 40 games in the AHL that year in Wilkes-Barre Scranton, but only got 7 points in 33 NHL games with the Penguins. Daigle did have a renaissance with the Minnesota Wild in 2003-2004, where he matched his career high in points in 78 games, but then he quickly fell back down to earth after the NHL lockouts. After the 05-06 season, he decided to move on to Europe, where he basically joined the Swiss League and spent a number of years with HC Davos, collecting a great amount of points, and basically ended his career in Europe with the Langnau Tigers in 2009-2010. In total, he played in just 616 NHL games, accruing 327 total points. He also played in just 12 playoff games, where he recorded only 2 assists. So yeah, that is the story of arguably the biggest draft bust in NHL history, and how his trade history also had a significant effect on the NHL's history books. So that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this one, and I'll see you all in my next video.